My name is Ken Snyder, and I'm a sales engineer at Kerio Technologies, and I cover the North American region. I'm joined by my colleague here at our San Jose headquarters, Brian Carmichael, and he comes from our training department team. We're going to cover just a quick agenda here for you to give you an idea of what we'll be going over during the course of today's webinar. First and foremost, we'll do a very brief overview of Kerio Control, just to reacquaint you with the product in case you've been away from it for a short period of time. We'll then dive into today's topic, which is internet performance. We'll cover some challenges and some common problems. We'll then work through some scenarios for overcoming those problems, and we'll do so in the context of using Kerio Control and building quality of service and bandwidth management rules. From there, we'll just review the before and after results, and then we'll go and give you a very, very brief preview of the 8.5 version of Kerio Control, which has been out in the wild for about a week and a half at this point. And then last but not least, we'll save questions and answers for the end. That doesn't mean you have to wait until then to pose your questions. You should see a Q&A box on the screen here where you're welcome to add some questions. And whichever of us is not currently speaking, whether it's myself or Brian, we'll do our best to answer your questions in the chat window as we go along throughout the presentation. Please be advised that at the end we are going to ask you for some feedback on the quality of our presentation, particularly Brian and myself and our abilities as speakers and presenters. And we'll also ask you about some topics that you'd like to see in the future. So please stick around and provide us with that valuable feedback after the webinar completes. So without further ado, let's just do a quick recap of Kerio Control. First and foremost, as most of you are probably aware, it is a firewall, a router, and it does include intrusion prevention and intrusion detection capabilities baked right into the product. It also includes antivirus software that's provided by Sophos, again, integrated into the product. You pretty much just have to tick a box to enable it, and the antivirus software works to protect your network and your users. It also includes web and content filtering, and we'll be using this in one of the rules later on, so you'll get a little bit more exposure to this throughout the course of today's webinar. But this allows you to restrict or deny or allow your users to visit specific websites that are categorized in a very easy fashion for you. We also provide usage reporting, and this usage reporting will be also part of today's webinar as sort of a forensics exercise, if you will. But one of the great things about Kerio's usage reporting is that if I'm a user on the network and I've got 5 devices that I've brought in one day, when you do your reporting and you're looking at my traffic patterns, you won't just see individual IP addresses of all those devices. They'll be aggregated together underneath my user ID profile. So you'll be able to see that Ken Snyder is conducting X, Y, and Z traffic, and it's aggregated across all my devices. So I've got an iPad and an iPhone in here today, as well as my laptop. Everything will show up under one user ID instead of segregated by IP address. We also provide secure VPN capabilities, and this is for site-to-site tunnel establishment. We've got a proprietary Kerio Control VPN technology that makes it very, very easy to establish site-to-site connections. We also support traditional IPsec connectivity between sites. And then we've also got some VPN client software that runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux platforms that's downloadable. Again, very easy to use, and there's some updates to that in the 8.5 release. And then for mobile devices, we rely on the native VPN applications and connectivity methodologies to establish VPN connections with those devices. Just to cover some of the flexible deployment in case you've used the product in the past, there's a hardware appliance that can be purchased and installed physically on site, and this comes in 2 varieties, a 1U rack-mounted unit, as well as a desktop unit. And then also here in the middle, an ISO file, which essentially acts as a a bare metal install. So it'll completely take over whatever hardware you choose to implement this on. And the installation methodology is typically a CD-ROM or a USB stick. And then lastly, VMware or Hyper-V, which essentially provides you a virtual appliance. So in your virtualization environment, you'll set up a new instance or container, and this Kerio Control instance will consume the entirety of that. So it's not a product that installs on Windows, it doesn't install on Linux, and it doesn't install on a Mac environment. It is its own self-contained system in order to provide a much more secure environment. So it's also very simple. If you've used any Kerio products at all, you'll recognize that the user interface is the same across all of our products. So if you're unfamiliar with Kerio Control, but you've had experience with Operator or Kerio Connect, when you first enter the administration environment, it should immediately look familiar to you. In addition to traditional web user interfaces for administering on a laptop or desktop device, the administration experience has also been optimized for mobile devices. So your iPads, iPhones, and Android devices can all act as sources for your administration needs. And then last but not least, today's topic, which is going to be quality of service and bandwidth management, that allows you to modify the way that specific types of traffic are treated in your network. And this can be done on a couple of from a couple of different angles. From a who angle, so who is it that's generating the traffic, and is it worth prioritizing? What type of traffic is it, and is it worth prioritizing or degrading? And then when, so time of day or specific circumstances when particular links may be available or restricted bandwidth or something like that. So let's look at some common problems from a user's perspective, and we'll do that by listening to some quotes that many of you may have heard at one time or another as IT professionals. So first of all is a big shot, or somebody that thinks they're a big shot, that may come to you one day and say, I'm important, I'm much more important than everybody else, and as a result of that, I need faster internet access than everybody else does. Believe it or not, those people do exist, and you may have come across them at one point or another, and they may be valid in some cases, as you'll see in the scenario that we depict later on today. A second quote that you may have heard is that my phone calls or some other type of real-time communication, whether it be a video conference like this, are choppy and they cut out periodically. Sales users are constantly on the phone, and they may be heavier users of VoIP traffic and may be more conscientious or aware of choppiness complaints from customers that are on the phone with, and they may come to you and you may need to do something about it. A last scenario could be the IT administrator or professional themselves who says, wait a minute, I've got a 10 megabit connection out of my office here, but it sure doesn't feel like we're getting that kind of throughput. I wonder if there's something that's impacting that, and what can I do to find out what's causing this slowdown and maybe make some modifications that improve the experience for business critical applications. So let's get right into things and come to sort of an agreement and understanding and get on the same page as to what types of limitations and reservations you might want to put into play. And we'll do so in the context of analogies to driving on the freeway. So when you're out on the freeway and you're in your car, you have to maintain a minimum speed limit. If you don't maintain a minimum speed limit, you're going to severely impact and negatively impact other drivers out on the road. You cannot just get on a freeway and drive 25 miles per hour when everybody else is going 65, 70 miles an hour. So in the network computing world, VoIP traffic needs to have a specific amount of bandwidth reserved for it, or the voice quality can degrade. Likewise, you can't have people driving 100 miles per hour when everybody else is driving 65. It causes havoc, collisions, and other bad things happen. Likewise, in the networking world, you may want to limit the amount of bandwidth that things like streaming media consume so that they don't disrupt our VoIP traffic up above. Another example is specific types of traffic. So trucks or hazardous materials, you may want to route them on specific roads. So you don't want them going through downtown or over poorly constructed bridges with heavy equipment or dangerous materials. You want to route them around there. So you don't want them to disrupt other parts of the city or the town. You want them to go specific routes, and you can do that with this product as well. And then the last scenario here, privileged traffic out on the highway. It's in California, at least, it's people riding motorcycles, people in electric cars, and people that have 2 or more occupants in the vehicle. And if they're commuting during business hours, as you can see here, 9:30 or 6:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. Monday through Friday, you want to give them access to sort of an accelerated lane. So you want to enhance the experience for those privileged users. And likewise, in your computer network, you may have things like we're doing right now, conferences and VoIP traffic, where you want to make sure that that privileged traffic gets the attention it deserves or the bandwidth that it deserves during business hours. So now that we're on the same page there, we'll cover a couple of scenarios for who, what, and when to prioritize traffic. And I think we've dropped a few clues already, but we'll go in a little bit deeper right now. So the animation here is going to be very critical. As you see, this equipment VIPs come in at a faster pace. Our staff and guests come in a little bit slower. So if we look at the axes here, as your importance goes up, so does your need for availability and speed. So we're going to use Kerio Control's quality of service and bandwidth management rules to make sure that equipment and VIPs get higher priority than staff and guests. From a what perspective, we've taken a simple approach here for our example, and we've broken things down into critical, useful, and disruptive traffic types. So this is what, not who, which we saw in the previous one, but what. And examples of critical communication are going to be things like web conferences, instant messages, VoIP traffic, and VPN connections. Normal uses are going to be things like web browsing, large file downloads, email, and multimedia. And things that we consider to be disruptive, and we're going to want to prioritize a little bit differently, are going to be social media, shopping, online games, and peer-to-peer traffic. So you can see that not all traffic is created equal. We want to have some priority here. We can't have disruption in this high category because it disrupts the experience for everybody that's involved. A little bit of disruption here or sacrifice doesn't really impact things. These type of activities, they'll carry on the same as they would, or they're not going to be highly impacted by some slowdown. They're activities that will resume and complete. If your email goes down, the servers will keep on trying and you'll eventually get it. Same with file downloads, things like that. And disruptive, we very often, we don't want to completely eliminate it, but we want to restrict it or discourage it. So we'll go through some scenarios for creating rules that do just that. So last category is when to prioritize. And the most obvious scenario is during operating hours. So 9 to 5, we want to make sure that our VoIP traffic, and I keep using that example, but it is a very critical one, teleconferencing, video communications, they all get the bandwidth that they deserve. So we want to make that available during business hours. We may have some anticipated high volume activities. So instead of us having this webinar via Adobe Connect, it may be that we had you all here in our headquarters and we gave you access to a guest network. Not something we normally do, but if we did have a 3-day conference and you were here, we might want to change our rules to allow more bandwidth to our guest network because we're going to have a higher volume of users here on site. Another example that you should be able to wrap your head around is a high school athletic event, whether it's football or basketball or something like that, or maybe a choir performance where you've got parents, students, staff, everybody out on the campus, and they may be accessing the guest network to take pictures and upload them to Facebook during after hours. So you may want to expand the bandwidth that's available for guest network or for social media and things like that during after school hours during those events. And the last scenario would be when you, for some reason, experience limited bandwidth. It could be that your primary connection goes down and you're reliant on now a slower connection, and you need to do some things to make sure that while you're in that scenario where you've only got access to limited bandwidth, that your higher priority traffic, whether it's who or what, gets the attention that it deserves. So let's dive into this with some actual examples using Kerio Control to craft these rules and address those scenarios. The first one, the person who determines that they are more important than everybody else. We identified them as the boss or the head honcho before, but in this case, in the real world, we'll use an example where they are the captain of a ship. So this is a maritime solution. And if we just take a look at this table, the when scenario is going to be when we are faced with a connection type that offers us very limited bandwidth. The who is going to be our VIPs and our equipment. So in that animated slide with the X and Y axis, owners and equipment, VIPs, were all considered to be high priority. We're going to apply our rule against all traffic types, and the way we're going to do this is through a bandwidth reservation. So the way that looks for you in Kerio Control and the bandwidth management tool is that owners and VIPs, we're going to just label this nicely here so that we know the context of the rule. The traffic is going to be who focused, owners and equipment. We've set a reservation rule as we've described, and we're saying that we want to have at least 1 megabit per second available for any individuals who log in and are identified as owners, or any IP addresses that encompass equipment that's on board the ship. And then for upload, we're going to set a reservation of 25% of that. And we're only going to do this, in this case, the when is not a time of day, but the when is when the traffic is going across the VSAT interface, the satellite connection. Okay? So scenario number 2, which was the VoIP traffic and the calls are choppy and cut out periodically. This is more of a traditional business scenario. And in this case, the when is before and after business hours. The who is going to be all employees, so anybody, doesn't matter, the who doesn't matter. But the what is going to be things that we identified as critical traffic. So in that slide that had the green, the yellow, and the red stripes going across, this is going to be the green traffic. And we're going to want to do this through a combination of bandwidth limitations, so to limit perhaps the normal traffic and the disruptive traffic, and then a reservation rule to reserve minimal amounts of bandwidth for the high priority or the critical traffic. So the way that looks, and we've color-coded everything very nicely here for you, is we've named them appropriately so it's easy to identify, and then we've lumped all the individual services, if you will, together so that our critical traffic is created or is treated equally. In the case of the top line there, instant messaging, remote access, VoIP traffic, and VPN, all considered to be high priority. And we've said a reservation rule for both the download and the upload, and in this case we've done a percentage of the link, and Brian's going to talk a little bit more about that during the live demo. And we're applying this across all interfaces and at all times. The ones below that, as Brian will discuss, have restrictions for business hours and use limitations rather than reservation rules. Our last scenario here is a guest network solution. So we've identified that our web browsing seems slow and we want to get to the bottom of things, and we're going to do that. An initial step is going to be some forensics work. So we're going to have a look at some of the built-in reporting capabilities that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. In this case, we're going to look at the active hosts and try to determine if there's any clues there as to what's causing our slowdown for some of our traffic. And what we can see here is through this little silhouette icon with the question mark next to it, that indicates to me that this is not a named user, but rather a device that exists on our guest network. And it's currently receiving a fairly large amount of data. So that's a good clue for me to start looking into things. And what I might do from there is then go and look at actual user statistics and see if I can pinpoint it to an individual user. And in looking at this, I see that there's nothing unusual here with my users, Ken, Brian, Alice, or the admin. Everything looks okay there. But where I notice some heavy traffic is with the guest users. And if we look at this number, this 347, in relation to the summary of all users, the 612 there, we see that the guest users are taking up about 2/3 of our bandwidth. That's not good. We don't want that. I want the bandwidth reserved for my staff, for myself, and business things that have to go on within the four walls of my business. And I don't want my guest users consuming all that bandwidth. So I'm going to create a rule that addresses that. And as you can see here, that's new in 8.5, not the QoS and bandwidth management, but rather the ability to apply a QoS rule to that specific guest interface. And so the way that looks here is we apply the rule to guest traffic or guest interfaces, and we're going to set limitations. So no more than 20% of the link for download and upload is to be used for guest networks. That means that the remaining 80% of my available bandwidth is dedicated to staff and business purposes that affect my company alone. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Brian, who's going to take us through a live demo. He'll describe the setup that he's done for you. He'll walk you through creating a few rules, and we'll even do some forensics exercises for you.
Okay, thanks, Ken. So you should be seeing my browser here. I've got the administration up, and so I'll walk through the configuration within the product of those various scenarios that Ken walked you through in the presentation. So I'll start off just by briefly showing you the setup that I have here on my local firewall with the interface configuration. I've got a multi-WAN setup here, and then I've got a guest network. Going over to IP address groups, you'll see I've got a pre-configured subnet here for my equipment that I'll use in the maritime example. And then I'm referencing that address group here in the traffic rules in my equipment rule, which I'll reference later on in the configuration. I've also configured in the content filter a few various rules for social networking, shopping, gaming, those disruptive types of scenarios that Ken mentioned in the presentation. You'll notice also that I'm choosing to allow these. You can also deny them on certain networks. You may just want to straight up not allow this type of behavior at all. In our example that we've set up here just to demonstrate QoS and the fact that you can apply restrictions on these categories of filters, we've explicitly allowed these, but we're going to discourage their use by applying restrictions on this type of activity. And then under the groups, you'll see I've created a group for owners and VIPs. This is related to, again, the maritime example where you have VIPs, crew and the boat owners and so forth. So that's kind of a unique type of installation that we see commonly with Kerio Control. So that's why we're sort of pointing it out here in the presentation. So with that, I'll jump over to the bandwidth management and QoS configuration. And you'll see I've already got a couple of items pre-configured. This is, again, just to kind of speed things up so that you're not watching me sort of meticulously configuring a bunch of policies. So I've laid out a few rules, but I'm going to go ahead and create a few of the others, starting with the maritime example, where we've got essentially addressing the who, basically the people that should have priority when you're in the circumstance that you're out to sea and you have some restricted internet bandwidth. So I'll start by configuring the traffic type. So I edit that cell and I click on add. And then I'm going to choose selected users or groups. And this is where I'll browse down to the group called owners and VIPs that I've pre-configured. And so now this rule is going to apply to those VIPs. I'm going to click add. And in the same rule, I'm going to refer to a traffic rule. So packets matching a traffic rule, and I've got this pre-configured rule for equipment that I had shown you just a few minutes ago. And so I will add equipment to this same rule. So now I'm applying it to the owners and equipment, and then I'm also going to apply a reservation, and I've pre-configured it to a 0.5 megabit. And as I'll show you just in a minute, when I configure the link speeds, you'll see why or how these values are relevant. So I'm going to set the same, an upload and download of 0.5 megabit. In both cases, we'll assume it's a synchronous line, and this is what I want to reserve to have sufficient bandwidth for both of these owners and equipment. But then I'm also going to set a time-based restriction, or rather a more of a conditional situation where these reservations are only going to apply when we're out to sea, when we're using this satellite link. So if we're in the harbor and we're using a high-speed link, there's no issues or concerns with making reservations. So we're not going to apply any bandwidth policies in that circumstance. It's only when the internet connection type is the satellite link. So before I apply this policy, the most important value that I want to configure is the link speeds. So as you see, I've reserved a certain amount here, but in order to do that, the firewall needs to be told how fast its link is so that it can properly make that reservation. And this is true whether it's a percentage-based value or a reservation. It's necessary to assign the advertised throughput of your internet links. So for the purpose of this example, I'm going to say it's a megabit up and down for the satellite. And then for our other hardwired connection, I'm going to assume about a 10 megabit connection, which is about what we have here that we're hosting this presentation from. So I'll go ahead and apply that policy. So the other scenarios of finding out that type of thing. So what we've set up here is a few different rules that are discouraging disruptive behavior, setting limits on the throughput for both upload and download, applying those only during business hours. And so you see it's a slightly less restrictive policy here for normal traffic. We're still giving them 50% of the link and restricting the upload to 1 megabit. So this rule kind of demonstrates the fact that you can apply both a percentage-based value as well as a hard limit in the same rule, and we're applying those to all interfaces. So pretty much even if you had load balancing, the same policy would apply regardless of the internet link that's actively used. But what we'll go ahead and configure here now is the actual critical services, just so you can kind of see what options we have for the traffic type. So I'm going to double click in this cell here and define my traffic type. So when I click add, you'll see all the different options that I have. I can choose large data transfers, which I have in the and you know, referring to connections matching a contract policies. And for this, I'll start off with voice over IP. Okay, and then I'm going to add the other services for remote access. So these are all the services that we've defined as important or mission critical. And you'll notice one of the key distinctions is that I'm selecting just a category of traffic. So I don't have to define all of the individual services. I don't have to specifically say VNC or Telnet or remote desktop, for example. The top level category is already associating all of those. So the firewall is doing a lot of the work and making it much easier for you as an administrator to configure these policies. So some of the other items that we've considered to be high priority or mission critical, let's see, it was virtual private networking, and the last item was instant messaging. And then we're going to want to set restrictions for the, or sorry, reservations for the upload and download. So I'm going to go ahead and say 10% of the link for the upload and download. So what that means is, as I've defined, at least for my WAN connection, 10 megabit, it means it's going to reserve about 1 megabit for the internet connection for these types of critical services. So now let's cover the last example. The internet connection. So as I'm speaking here, I think Ken is pulling up his phone and kind of queuing up certain activities so that we can have a demonstration here. So now when I go under active hosts, under status, which is where we're going to do much of, or we're going to start the forensic research, I can see here the current activity, and I can see that Ken is downloading pretty much the full capacity, 1.5 megabit per second, and it looks like he's also performing some activity from his iPad as well. If we click on his item and go to activity, we can see more specifically what it is he's doing, and it's updating in real time. You can see the value here is changing. It looks like he's doing an active download. He's just grabbing, and we can even see the name of the file, the Windows version of Kerio Connect. And then here you can see he's got some Google video, so he's got a couple of YouTube videos it looks like going on. And if we go to connections, we can see right now there's no bandwidth management rules that are applying, so pretty much he's using everything. And as Ken pointed out, icon here is network, so we're determining that, okay, for pretty much eating up all of the bandwidth. So what we're going to do is set a policy that is going to restrict this behavior. So if we go back to the bandwidth management in QS, we've got the guest rule. Let me just turn that on. Let me set the traffic add and choose guest interface, which, as Ken pointed out, is something that's new to 8.5. Previously, you could have interfaces. So in the download, I'm going to say don't exceed half the link, and we'll go ahead and set that for the upload as well. Now that once I apply this, we should find when I go back to the active hosts that Ken's active download is very shortly here going to be throttled. And so now it was basically cut in half. So now he's only getting half of the bandwidth, which is about kilobytes per second. So we can see that almost immediately he was affected by this policy, and we can see here that the bandwidth management column is indicating that all of his connections are applying this guest's bandwidth rule. So that was the last bit. There actually is one other point I want. In regards to rules which make demand reservation. Here I'm reserving 10% critical services. But if none of one of these types of services, that the reservation will actually be put in place and made active. So it's not a permanent kind of restriction on the line. It's again, it's an on-demand type of reservation.
By the way, If the audio was a little bit choppy, it was probably because I was consuming so much
Yeah.
of the bandwidth at the time, and I've now shut down those videos and the
Right.
downloads that I was performing. So hopefully the audio is back.
Right. So let's go ahead and switch back now to the presentation, and I'll let Ken finish up with the presentation.
Thank you, Brian. That was great. And again, our apologies for the choppy audio if you experienced any at all. Again, it's highly likely because I was consuming so much of the bandwidth. May have overdone it here in the demo. Anyway, so just to kind of review and point you in the right direction for resources that'll help you revisit this topic after the webinar today. These links here, I'll let you read through those on your own. You don't have to jot them down right now. At the end of the presentation, there'll be a window or a little panel, I guess, that'll have a bunch of these links for you, so you can visit these topics after the fact. So let's just get to the review, and it's a very, very simple review of the before and after, and it's illustrated through some animation that should make a lot of sense to you. Before QoS, all traffic is created equally. So we have this very cute animation where all of our traffic, the who up at the top and the what down below, all travel together at the same pace. And it was a fairly medium pace, not too slow, but not very fast at all. And what we really wanted to achieve, and which we got after the QoS, is these varied, I guess, allocation of bandwidth. The high priority stuff indicated in green and the wider bands, the yellow medium bands and the normal traffic, and then our disruptive in red and the much thinner bands. And you'll see that the way these travel across the screen, it reflects our achievement after applying those QoS rules. So as you can see from this, spending a little bit of time acknowledging the complaints and the concerns of your users and constructing some well thought out rules using the QoS and bandwidth management tools can really have a very positive impact on the experience for your network and improve things like voice communication, web conferencing, VPN connectivity, etc., and discourage the use of things like Facebook, shopping, gaming, and peer-to-peer activities that, without completely shutting them down, but by throttling them back so far, people are less inclined to use them during the course of their business day. So with that, the presentation of our main topic out of the way, we've just got a single slide with some explanations of some of the 8.5 features. And again, this was released about a week and a half ago. First and foremost is two-step verification, which allows you to improve the security for remote access. What happens in this case is that there's a requirement for an additional form of identification for remote users. And what it is essentially is a time-limited code that is generated by a mobile app. So in addition to having the user ID and password, you've got this time-sensitive numerical sequence that has to be entered in by the user. So if my ID and password are somehow compromised and a hacker tries to penetrate the system externally, they're going to need that second authentication factor in order to successfully gain access to the network. And it's very unlikely that they'll have that. The next feature is service discovery forwarding. And what this does is it allows broadcast devices such as Apple TV, printers on your network, for example, to work across different IP subnets, including VPNs. So when you're accessing remotely, you'll have access to those devices to print, for example. You may be at home and print to a network printer in your office. There's also new and improved alerts, and these are going to be for system alerts, for log file alerts, traffic rule alerts, etc. And again, you can read more about those on the release notes, which will be, the link for that will show up in the next advancement of this slide. Some VPN client improvements as well, and this is across all the VPN clients, so the Windows, the Mac, and the Linux distributions. And there's more than that, but those are some of the highlights, and we invite you to go and visit our website to see the release notes and investigate all the improvements and new features that have been added.